Hold that energy while we yas. Yas.
Last summer, for my sister's birthday, we decided to take her to an Offspring gig. And it was the first punk rock show that I enjoyed from the middle of the pit. I don't usually go clubbing because the thought of strangers' sweat coming too close to my own skin is really, really frightening for me. So when we pushed our way into the crowd to get to the pit of the concert, what I was actually doing was pushing my limits to places that were beyond my wildest imagination. And I did it because I was strongly attracted by it, by some sort of gravitational energy that was calling me. And when I got to the pit, the feeling that I had was that of being swollen by a sort of primordial broth of heat and violence, which was, strangely enough, both reassuring and suffocating. I got to taste the sweaty fluids of strangers, the unwanted darkness of fluffy armpits, and even a dirt-encrusted shoe that landed directly into my mouth. And I got hit by arms, by legs, by heads, especially elbows. And after the second song, the whole audience turned into a meat cluster that unintentionally tried to crush my ribcage for an hour and a half. So I really hated the experience of fighting for my own survival without even being able to move or breathe. But at the same time, I was very glad that I did it because I got to look into the depths of how controversial is our connection to other human beings, how violent and desired it can be. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of our Magnificent Shit podcast. I am Fla, and I'm here joined by the incredible human beings that go under the name of Thaddeus, Teresa, Katie, Alina, and Carl. The poem that I want to read you today is called At My First Punk Rock Show Ever by Hanif Abdurraquib. At my first punk rock show ever, me and Tyler dive into the pit head first, even though 4 older boys got on jackets that say no blacks and queers. And between the 2 of us, me and Tyler got that covered. Because I duck and throw my hands over my head when the drum kicks too sharp, and I don't know what could be more black than that. And Tyler don't know it, but in the alley last month, I watched him build a church in the mouth of a boy from across town who don't say nothing to nobody and don't come around the hood unless he's thirsty for a tithe. But we up in the pit anyway, because it ain't the 70s anymore. What I mean is there ain't always a war on television. What I mean is we come here to see blood, like all boys who sneak past their sleeping fathers in ripped jeans. And don't all blood look the same when bodies are getting thrown like they're in a cheap amusement park ride? And some girl from the burbs thinks she's sleek and tries to creep into the violence, but Tyler grabs her by the collar and throws her clean out. And with the guitar bending over her head like a halo, I can hear him whispering, "Some things are just unacceptable." And then his whole body begins to shake, and I can tell myself it must be laughter. I want to start by asking Teresa, who's a gifted and talented drum player and so has had the experience of being on the other side of the stage, what she thinks about this poem.
Wow. Wow, that's a really good question. It's funny. It's like I don't think about I don't think about the audience when I'm on stage. That's one of the things that really drawn me to drumming. I've always wanted to be a drummer when I was a kid. And I was in middle grade school, and they were auditioning for, getting people to go into band. And I wanted to be a drummer, one of the drummers. And the instructor, the music instructor, who was a male, white male, said, "Girls don't drum." So I was given a flute, and I hated that instrument. I mean, I know there's a lot of great flautists out there, whatever they're called, but it just wasn't for me. But I was forced to play that instrument for 4 years, and I pretty much resented it. So when I got into drumming fairly recently, I'm pretty much middle-aged person who wandered into a hand drumming class on behest of Thaddeus, who was my husband, and I went to the damn class just to get him off my back. And I discovered that, I really love drumming. And the reason why I love drumming is because it's empowering. And one of the things I learned from my instructor, who was a older woman by the name of Simone LaDrama, she's a Brooklynese person, and she was so overtaken by the spirit of the drum that she changed her name to Simone. It used to be Bertha, but now, she changed it to Simone LaDrama because she was so taken by the spirit of the drum. And that's one of the things I took away from becoming a performer, is that when you're on stage and you're playing the drum, it's almost like you become a conduit for something else. She calls it the spirit of the drum. It feels like someone else is taking the reins. I'm taking, when I solo and when I play, I'm just the person who's breathing. The person who has my hands is something else. And it's very spiritual, and there's a lot of spiritual philosophy behind drumming and so on and so forth. But as far as a punk rock show, I mean, I've been to a few rough shows, and I think the thing that really struck me about this particular poem was, especially in punk, the background of punk is, the white English kids not being able to, live a profitable life, meaning, they couldn't find work and they were poor. And so since they were poor, they returned to crime, or, just being in a group of other poor kids was a crime. And so they were persecuted because of who they were. And the thing that I thought was interesting about punk, especially English punk, was that, the sign, no blacks, no homos or whatever. And that's what punk is all about, is to break through those conventions, right? Because if anyone can feel oppressed, is Black people and homosexuals, of course, because, they couldn't be themselves. And for punk rock or punk kids to say, no, that's not cool. And also, when he throws the girl out, it's like, it's okay for guys to draw blood, but not for girls. Anyways, I'm taking up too much time. Alina, what do you think about the poem?
I didn't know that about the history of punk rock. So thank you for elucidating that for me, because now I can have more of an opinion. Okay, so I actually have never had the experience of going up to that mosh pit area, because getting anywhere near that reminds me of being on a Soviet tram as a child and having to touch those gross poles so that I don't fall over, and just like the incredible feeling of just being constricted and constrained and not being able to control that or make another choice. So when I see a mosh pit, I'm like, really? You guys are volunteering for this right now? It's like the Soviet tram thing is just not, yeah, not appealing. But that said, now I kind of want to go, because the way Vlad describes it, I'm like, yeah, the violence and desire all mixed into one thing, like that's an intriguing transcendental experience. But I'm gonna say another Soviet thing, which is building on what you said, Teresa, which is this, when I first, I am not, I'm a white female, I guess, so like that's the character that was easiest for me to relate to. And it's funny because they had me, they had me until they threw that girl out, and then I was like, wait a second, that's not very nice. But it reminds me of when the Soviet Union fell apart. When the Soviet Union fell apart, there was this kind of underclass of people who were poor and didn't have options, which were a lot of people, basically everybody who wasn't part of the kleptocracy of the Soviet regime and wasn't able to get away with the public goods. Everyone who wasn't a thief, basically, was kind of screwed in that system, right? So it was, and racism emerged out of that world. So during the Soviet period, one of the things that the propagandists used to say is, hey, we've got to bring the Americans down. I mean, look what they're doing. They even have racism, and it was like so understood that racism was not an okay thing to even like to that wasn't okay. And then all of a sudden we had skinheads emerge out of that poverty and out of that oppression. And it was like it went from 0 skinheads to a lot of skinheads. And I thought and then all of a sudden Black people weren't safe traveling to Russia, and you had actual violence. And I was like, what is this? How is this possible? And then I realized that you could not as a human being just feel like you were at the bottom of the whole thing. We're social animals. And when you're at the bottom of the whole thing, it's so painful to feel so rejected and not have any sources of power. And then you have to create somebody underneath you that you can kind of oppress. And I think we all have everything in us. We have all of the personality traits. We have the evil and the good. We have the desire to love and the desire to oppress. But the problem is, like, the oppressed, it's very hard for the oppressed not to follow the urge to oppress. And this is where, I don't know, I think this poem was interesting and brought out that we have that within us. Like, they were so sweet to each other, and that boy across town, you could see him as a human, but they needed somebody. Like in the mosh pit hierarchy, that girl didn't belong, so they could throw her out. And it's just like it all coexists at the same time. That's all I got, guys. It's paradox. All truth is paradox.
The Soviet mosh pit of like the fucking bus.
The Soviet mosh pit of oppression, okay?
The Soviet mosh pit of oppression, yes. Oh my God. Like I have to say, it's Katie. Because punk actually is something super familiar to me. I used to be a punk, and it was like a really important part of my life, of course, because when you're part of subculture, it defines you. And I was a teenager, and I was a young teenager when I first watched a film called Billy Elliot, and there was London Calling in that film, that song, and suddenly I was like, okay, was like reborn as some sort of new person. And I was 14, so also like an age where you just pick on whatever speaks to you directly. And I think at that point I also was not feeling exactly right in my femininity, like, you in this weird transition thing. And also I was growing up really quickly, so all my girlfriends were still looking like children, but I was like the tallest and had breasts, and it was really confusing time. And punk was sort of something that freed me from it. And 2 things made me think about this poem. First was when I was 14 and went to my first punk concert in my city, which is the city of fucking skinheads as well, which is tough. Białystok is like a skinhead capital of Poland. But we went to the first punk concert, my cousin and I, and it was a Christian punk rock band, but it was the only one we could find, so we just went there. And before we got to the concert, we stole from my parents' cabinet this chocolate liqueur that was like 10 years old, like a tiny Mozart liqueur, and we downed it next to the church. And then we went to the concert, and we were 14, promised my parents to be back at like 9 p.m. and that we would take a taxi and be super safe. So on one hand, you promise to be the safe girl. On the other hand, you are in the Christian punk mosh pit. It was ridiculous. And afterwards we came back home and I was throwing up the spaghetti from yesterday, but it was the best night we've ever had. And you know, it was so fun. And then the second thing that makes me think about this poem is a year later, I was still like a super punk. And at that point, I was referred to in my class as filth. It was tough time, but I wore that word with pride. And my friend who was also a punk and my cousin, we were giving away leaflets in that area that we sort of knew we were not supposed to go because it was called New Mexico in my city. This is the area that's referred to as New Mexico, but it's a total skinhead area. But because we were like 14, 13-year-old girls, sort of didn't occur to us that we would be treated democratically by these skinheads. So we were walking around giving away these leaflets, and suddenly, you know, we see this guy walking behind us, like this super skinhead, like the king skinhead of that area that you know, because between his time in prison, he hands down punks. And we started walking quicker. He started walking quickly. At some point, so we start to jog and he started to jog. And my cousin didn't believe that he could be chasing us. But then we were just like, Anya, come on, like, obviously this is happening. So we started to run and he just ran after us. And we started running towards this bus stop, you know, the 14-year-old girls. But he wouldn't stop. And at the bus stop, we started just yelling for people to help us, but nobody did even acknowledge us. So the guy threw a bottle at us. He didn't hear us. Then he had another bottle that he threw at us, but the bus arrived to whoever like knows where, but we just got on the bus and the guy still threw a bottle at glass and just like, we could see him laughing like this, you know, antagonist. And we were just like, shit, you know, in the punk world, we are punks, not girls. And in a way, it was this weird experience of empowerment, like, oh, for the first time, you know, it's democracy. I am treated like anyone would be treated. It doesn't matter that I'm 14. But this was scary, and in a way, I wish I had like some sort of female privilege in this world where I wasn't enough, you know. And like a week later, my friend came to school, and she had this horrible bruise on her back because they got her and they kicked her, like, you know, American History X style. And it was just like, oh my God, this is happening to 14-year-old girls. Yeah, but so this poem like makes me think of all these times, and I look back at them with this mixture of fear, but also empowerment and freedom, and what weird time it was, you know, where for the first time I didn't have to feel like anyone. It was just fine to be yourself. It was amazing. So yes, like, it was crazy those times. Oh God, Christian mosh pit. What?
I love that you stole money to go to a Christian punk show. That's amazing.
Yes, and drank liqueur, chocolate liqueur from Austria with Mozart on it, you know, like there's a lot.
So this is Jeff. I remember just this mystique of the mosh pit because I've always loved music, and I remember asking my older friends, like, tell me about this pit. Like, what are the rules? Like, how does it work? Like, is anything like off, you know, are there things you can do and can't do, and how does it work? And I remember this kind of old sage, like heavy pot smoking older brother friend of ours who was like, man, you can choose to go in, but you can't choose to come out. And I thought that was like fascinating. And so then I was really intrigued by it. And so then I became kind of like a mosh pit connoisseur. Like, I found I really loved them. And, you know, I was like big enough even at 16, 17 to not get immediately trampled, but they were so different. And I think his advice was actually really good because there's kind of this group of people around a mosh pit, at least at the shows I was going to, that were like the gatekeepers of the pit. And they weren't really in the pit, but they were like in this liminal place between pit and crowd. And they were like very courteous, almost like gatekeepers of like a club or something. They're just like, do you want to go in? And you'd be like, yeah. And then, but then once you were in, you were just like an animal. And like these same people would not let you back out, like pulsing against them. You're like, oh my God. And they're just like, sorry, man. You're just kind of like in this stew. And there are just these like different, you know, like if you go into a pit of like Rage Against the Machine, it's like people like kind of want to murder you for whatever reason. Like there's like punching and kicking and like cleats and crazy shit. And there were other like, you know, heavy metal kind of mosh pits I went into they were mostly white, but there was this amazing mix of races and even ages. And yeah, it was amazing. It felt really good. Like I felt like I could lose myself in a mosh pit because all the bullshit static of my brain was just turned off because I was just trying to survive. And then there was all this human contact. And I didn't play sports really. Like I didn't have like the physical contact really in sports. So I really liked that physical contact, and I liked rough physical contact. Like it was really fun. But each pit had its own culture, and I found that really interesting. And I'd say like on the other side of the Rage Against the Machine pit, where I got kicked, you know, to bleeding by cleats, which just, that's not cool. That's not cool, Mr. Cleats in the pit. Not cool. But I went to this pit at the Hold Steady in Portland. And most of the guys in the pit looked like the same guys I was in the pit with when I was 16, but now they also were almost 40. And we were all in this pit together. And it was like the most courteous mosh pit like I'd ever been in. Like people couldn't even hide the joy. They were just like laughing and like smiling and still crashing into each other and knocking each other over. But they're like, "Oh, are you okay, man?" Like the pretense was all gone. Like no one had to be tough anymore, but we were still just like loving it. And yeah, so I loved that, and I loved that this poem hit upon that. So I still would go into a pit. I would still go today.
Yeah, this is Carl, and I can honestly say the way that I studied for my last final my junior year was by going to a Metallica concert in Baltimore at M&T Bank Stadium, right? And this was around May, and it was the first stop of their North American tour. It might have actually been the world tour that they were doing in support of their most recent album, which was Hardwired to Self-Destruct. And my roommate and I got floor tickets. So we got general admission down there. They had Volbeat and also Avenged Sevenfold opening for them at this concert. So him and I go down into the pit, and as it starts getting closer to Metallica's kickoff time, we start seeing different kinds of people show up in the pit. Like originally it was just a bunch of people standing around with beers, you know, kind of just watching the opening acts, that kind of stuff. But then when the Jason Momoa body double shows up, you know shit's about to get serious in the mosh pit for Metallica. It's like, okay. And we weren't intending to be in the mosh pit, but as Jeff mentioned with Gatekeepers, it became apparent as it was time for the music to start from Metallica's set that we had been elected part of the ring. So in the mosh pit, you've got the pit that's happening in the center where people are moving around and everything. And then we were right on that outer rim of we're standing here to watch the concert. We can feel the fire shooting up from the stage pyrotechnics. And we just have an occasional someone running into our shoulders as we're standing there to watch. Necessarily by choice, but you know, we're both sizable gentlemen. We can deal with that. And the part that made this pit crazy is not only the fact that it was Metallica, but as we're standing there, we noticed that there was a man in a wheelchair who was in the pit. So the way this was working is that people were flying around in the same way we described and that kind of stuff, like running at each other, hitting each other, but obviously enjoying it. And the dude who was in the wheelchair was having the time of his fucking life in that pit. So he's spinning the wheels on his wheelchair with enough velocity, right, to where he's not really getting jostled that much, but he is absolutely loving everything that's happening in terms of that, because people are lowering their shoulders to hit his, they're kind of pushing him around. This is a full fucking team effort in that pit. So the wildest part of that show was during the song Fuel, I'm pretty sure. And Fuel is the one where as soon as James Hetfield screams, "Give me fuel, give me fire, give me that which I desire," shit, that's a signal for people to go crazy. And my roommate and I are standing there, and as we're looking, I will never forget this image. We're close enough to the stage where we can not only see James Hetfield, Kirk Hammett on that side, but then there's this thing that we see that people are pushing right on top of the crowd. And it's like, oh, that's a wheelchair and there's no one in it. So we're standing there watching the wheelchair, which had a man in it 30 seconds before in the pit, just kind of drifting towards the stage. And my roommate is like, what the fuck is going on? He's going the opposite direction. So this man is getting carried by the crowd on a wave going towards the stands, and the chair is going towards the stage. And we're like, something about this is wrong. So stadium security obviously flood the pit that way. The Jason Momoa body double is shaking his head like, how the hell did this happen? The man got reunited with his wheelchair, and it was an interesting experience for me because flash forward 6 months later, and I'm telling a different friend at a different concert, but we were at the Maryland State Fairgrounds. Now, there is no official like capital of white people for the Baltimore area, but the Maryland State Fairgrounds is a gathering place usually. I can say this as a white person who's lived in Baltimore for tangentially. But I'm telling him this story, and I'm like, dude, you know, that guy had two main things that were apparent in terms of this. He was having the time of his life. He didn't really have a good time when he was separated from his chair, but here was a black dude, right, at a metal concert in a wheelchair who was having the time of his life in terms of this. And as we're walking up to the line to get beer, which by the way was ridiculous at this concert, it was the Ravens countdown to kickoff. The same guy is there in his wheelchair in that beer line as if he had heard me talking about this. So I walk up, I'm like, dude, are you a Metallica fan? He's like, fuck yeah, I'm a Metallica fan. So we had this catch-up moment. I was like, man, I am so happy that you got reunited with this and have continued your awesome ability to attend these concerts. So yeah, it's something where the pit can be a place where things like physical contact and violence and accessibility for everyone to have fun in those spaces can be possible. And the question is, as Hanif Abdurraquib's poem, you know, comes back to, how do we continue to match up, you know, and create spaces in terms of all music, metal and punk and hard rock, that match up with that same ethos of being a place where everybody can have that experience.
Carl, I'm reminded of, this is Thaddeus. I'm reminded of my last two punk shows. The second to the last was the Ramones in 1998 at the 99 Club in South Aurora, which is south of Seattle. And for God knows what reason, it was a dinner show. I shit you negative. And so they had, you had a choice of beef or chicken because fuck vegetarians, right? It's a punk show. And so they have all these tables out, and I went with my friend and student JD Webster, and so we're sitting there eating dinner, and none of the dishes have been cleared away, and all of a sudden they flood the place with enough smoke to like close down a fucking airport, and then the lights come up and you hear 1, 2, 3, 4, right? It's the Ramones, right? And everybody jumps on the fucking tables and, of course, starts kicking off the dishes and the glasses, because we had actual glasses and glass beer bottles, and starts throwing them, right? And at that point, the mosh pit is empty, but everybody crowds in. And at that point, there were too many people on the floor. And so me and JD jump up on the table and we start slamming on the table, right? You know, and if you guys went to a Ramones show, it's just like a song, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, and then a song, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, and then a song, and then halfway through their set, there's this big silence, and Joey Ramone always goes, "This place sucks," and then goes on into the rest of the set, right? So that's the format of the show, essentially. And so at one point, me and JD are slamming on top of the table, and we see this guy, you know, just like slamming with a ghost, apparently, no one else, and he's on this table, and the table's rocking, and we're like, some shit is gonna happen, right? And the table flips, and dude, wishbones right on the edge of the table. Okay, so for those of you not receiving the video portion of the program, a wishbone is when a man's groin engages the edge of a table from a full height. Okay, so at that point, we're like, okay, this is totally out of hand, and we decide to jump into the mosh pit, and I jump from my table to the mosh pit and suddenly realize there's a bunch of broken glass on the bottom of the fucking mosh pit because everybody threw glasses and beer bottles in there. Fortunately, the mosh was so thick that I never touched the ground. So, okay, so that was second to the last. Last show was Alice Donut and Blood of the Lamb at the legendary CBGB in New York.
Wow.
And I was taken there by a friend of mine. It was my first trip to New York as an unaccompanied adult. And the funny thing was that it was reasonably sedate. I mean, there was no pit to speak of. And it was interesting to me because it kind of felt like, Jesus, are we at the end of the punk era already? It's only 1989, you know? So it's only been like 12 years. But I mean, the cool thing about being at CBGB, I mean, if you guys have never been, first of all, is a complete shithole. It reminded me of my my Uncle Gerald's dairy barn, because there were like cobwebs and shit in there, and it smelled like crap because the guy who owned the place like kept his dogs in there and they shit all over the place. So it was appropriate for punk rock. But the really cool thing was like all the dressing rooms were open in the back, and we were able to go back and see where like the police and the dead Kennedys and everybody like signed the walls. So those are my last two big punk experiences. And it's funny. There's something that somebody else said, and I can't put my finger on it right now, but it seemed like a safe place, a safe, you know, quote unquote place for wild abandon. So I was exploring in an essay a while back, like what it's like to get hit and to get multiple concussions, because, you know, I used to kickbox and I have multiple concussions, and other people who have experienced this say the same thing. It's like you get this weird endorphin-like feeling, like being in love, like getting a concussion. It's like the pain is not there. The first thing that you get is the endorphins. And it's a whole body kind of feeling. Wow. And there are, you know, different names for every type of feeling that we have, for instance, or every type of sense that we have. They're not limited to 4. So like interoception is like knowing what's going on in your body, essentially like knowing that your heart is racing or knowing that you have a stomach ache. Nociception is the ability to feel pain and understand where it's coming from. So we're not limited to taste, you know, touch, smell, sight, and so on. And so I came up with a word for getting hit really hard and the feeling that comes with it. And it is philioception. And it is the feeling of being in love, the bodily feeling of being in love. And I've, you know, tried to, you know, related that to other people, and they're like, oh yeah, like the time I got knocked out in football, or oh yeah, the time that I was in a mosh pit, you know? So it is wild and it's violent, and but the thing that I most closely related to is the feeling of being hit so hard that you feel like you're in love, if that makes any kind of sense. So that's where that poem took me back to. You know, it actually took me back to 1988 at the Ramones show, and it was like being there.
I wanted to say something about the poem, and, you know, what Carl and what Thaddeus was saying about being in love, and, you know, a safe place in which to, you know, lash out or scream or whatever. And, you know, Thaddeus and I were married, and, you know, we've been married for a long time, and we've come to the conclusion that when you're a kid, you know, when you're like 3 or 4 years old, you can like take off your clothes, run around naked and scream, right? And nobody bats an eye because you're allowed to do that. But, you know, as soon as you get older, you're not allowed to do that anymore. Like, you know, standing up in a restaurant and going, you know, I love spaghetti, you know, you know, that sort of thing. And the only time an adult can do that is at a concert and at a football game, where, you know, you can, you know, scream at the top of your lungs, and no one can, you know, bat an eye, because that's the place where you're supposed to, in a mosh pit at a concert, or, you know, in the throes of, you know, watching your team go to the Super Bowl or whatever. You can't do it in a restaurant anymore. You can't do it out on the street, right? Unless you want to be labeled as a crazy person. But those are the safe places in which to do that nowadays.
Not to be a wet blanket, but in the poem, it's not a safe place for everyone. It's like the hierarchy, like it's sort of what Jeff was saying, right? About like every pit has its own sociology. Every group of humans come together and create their own sociology. And like in his story, in his mosh pit, they created a sociology where it wasn't safe for everybody to express themselves.
Well, that's the whole thing. I mean, that's the reason why he was laughing at the end. I mean, I think he was, the irony of, you know, how he wasn't allowed because he was black and gay or whatever. And then him being the person to throw someone out because they didn't belong there.
Yeah, I think he was crying though. I don't know. How did you guys read it? My interpretation was that he was crying and his friend was pretending that his friend tried to imagine that he was laughing.
Yeah.
Because it's like, I think it was the grief of like his general inability to express himself and be himself in the world that made him act that way.
Yeah, and that's something that I thought about as well, just in terms of not only my story but that, where it's like it's something where that space can be that way and it should be that way, but in many ways it's often not for some people, right? And so it's that distance between like having potential for this to be a place that can be inclusive and then how to work against it being exclusionary, right?
Yeah, because humans, I mean, I think we all aspire to inclusion and then practice exclusion all the time against our values because we want to have a way that we can belong. And it's hard to belong to something without creating a border where there's an us and a them.
When I was
100%.
when I was in high school and like met other punk kids, turned out that I was not a cool punk because I was into English punk, and there was this whole Polish punk that people were listening to, and suddenly there were like these two groups formed, one being me and the rest of the punks. But it was like so strange, like, oh no, it's not enough to be a punk. You have to like listen to these bands, and it's different from those bands, and oh god, yeah.
Yeah, I really think that the poem is a representation of what society is and what we've all been saying with all the contradictions and the wish to, you know, be and set up an inclusive place and then ending up not including people. I think we can rate the poem with our biscuit system. It must be time. And so I'm asking you to rate this poem from, you know, 0 biscuits, which is saying that you loved it and in its purest form, and you don't need to add any biscuit to it, to 5, which is that you actually needed a lot of sugary food to go along with it. Jeff?
Oh my gosh. So I had not read or listened to this poet before. Can you pronounce the name for me because I don't want to get it wrong?
Hanif Abdurraquib, I think. Is that?
Hanif, I'd never read Hanif's work, and I got so I was almost late to this call because I got so swept into listening to a bunch more of his work, and it was amazing. And then I was just like writing my own poem because it was just so good. Like listening, this guy is amazing. He's amazing. And that said, I needed 1 biscuit for this particular poem. And it was because of the line, built a church in his mouth. I'm just saying, for me, that line kicked me out of the poem. Tobias Wolff has this thing where he says, you know, a short story has to win by knockout. A novel can win by technical knockout because you have way more words and way more space. And with a poem, 1 line, I just had to eat a biscuit for that 1 line. But this poet is amazing. And thank you so much for turning me on to his work.
So Jeff, so my biscuits, I got 0 biscuits, but it's funny. It's because of that line. Yeah, it's because of that line. And not that it's like that line was revealed to me. It was because it opened up such a mystery for me. And I was like, oh, okay, it's taken me somewhere. Because I read the whole poem and I'm like, oh, it's taking me to a specific place in my personal history, right? And then that 1 line was such an inviting mystery to me because it was no longer my personal history. It was someone else's. And they were trying to explain their reality to me. And I was like, oh shit, we have a bridge here. And I don't quite understand it. And now I really want to dig into it. So yeah, Hanif Abdurraquib is amazing. Jeff, you should pick up the book. They Can't Kill Us Till They Kill Us.
I ordered it yesterday.
Oh yeah, oh man, it's really phenomenal. And the people who live in Gambier, Ohio and Columbus are lucky because he lives there and he speaks at Kenyon like every 5 minutes. And you should also follow him on Twitter because unlike most writers, he doesn't talk about writing and he doesn't talk about what's going on in the publishing world. He talks mostly about basketball and tennis shoes and music, and it's awesome. There you go.
Hey, I'm Teresa, and I give it 0 biscuits. I love this poem. I think Hanif Abdurraquib is absolutely wonderful, and I love his ability to bring up the things that he deals with racism and oppression on every day. But the thing about the line, what was the line again? The cathedral.
Built the church in a boy's mouth.
In his mouth.
To me, the thing that I saw when I read that line was getting kicked in the teeth, and your teeth are no longer these perfect lines. They're broken, and they become like the shape of a church. That's what I thought of, and I related to that because what happens in a mosh pit? You lose your teeth. You get kicked in, with cleats or whatever, and I thought that was a very poetic way of getting your teeth broken in something that, that you're just trying to express yourself.
Yeah, this is Carl, and I have no biscuits, honestly, for not only this poem, but I mean it when I say, and I know I'm one of the younger members of Magnificent Ship, but I've never seen, at least, or I've never read someone write about music better than Hanif Abdurraquib does. And on that topic of these kind of dualistic environments that are both somewhat trying to be inclusive but exclusive, his essay about A Night in Bruce Springsteen's America is absolutely phenomenal. His poetry for me is one thing, but as an essayist, he is fucking transcendent. And that essay, I think, is another great one to look up aside from his Twitter feed and buying his book, Thaddeus already mentioned.
I cannot wait to read that.
Yeah. Oh, it's fucking phenomenal. It is phenomenal.
Oh, he also teaches a class on the Skillshare app about lyrical essay. And I think there's a free trial period if you just want to sign up for the app and just check that out. It's really awesome.
Wow.
Sorry, it's not. I sound like I'm his agent or something.
Could you become his agent, Thaddeus, and introduce us, please?
Yes.
So he's amazing. This was a great poem. I don't think we should rate the poem according to how much we love the author in general. I feel like he's a 0 biscuit author, but this was a 1 biscuit poem, but on a scale of 0 to 5, right? And the reason I say that is when I read it and then a second time, it just didn't have the same emotional impact that it could have, and that some of his other work does in this topic, if you will, of the inclusion versus exclusion. I just think he could have done a little bit more with the imagery. I don't know, I think after we've discussed it, I feel it more, but before we discussed it, I didn't feel like I was there. But at the same time, he is 100% amazing. And I think that we just, in this particular poem, it was great work, but it didn't take me all the way there. 1 biscuit.
For me, it was a 0 biscuit poem, and I guess because of the personal story behind it, it really took me there. Oh my God. And it was wonderful. But another book that I want to recommend by him is Go Ahead in the Rain, because this is what I read. I haven't read yet, but I do have it. They Can't Kill Us Until They Kill Us. But I read Go Ahead in the Rain, and holy shit, it's another amazing book. And also because once I was done with punk, I got into hip hop. So suddenly it was wow, now this is my other childhood or teenagehood. And yeah, I religiously read this book. It was so fucking amazing. And I don't know, he's such a great poet, it's true. And I know it's not about him in general, but this one poem. But I don't know, to me, he's always so genuine. He never is trying to impress anyone. I don't know, there's something really incredible about that, I think. And this was also that poem. And also because Flaminia, you sent a link to his reading, and I think there's also something about that, the way he reads is so powerful.
Oh,
so
yeah.
It's not just reading, but to hear him read his poems is
Let's get him on the show.
Yes. Yes.
Should.
Yeah, 0 biscuits for me too. And yes, read everything he's written, but watch the videos that you can find online because he's amazing. And he goes to slam poetry contests, and he's just it's incredible. And oh my God, what I wanted to say, I forgot. But yeah, let's have him on the show. And, and thanks for tuning in, everybody.
Yeah, once Thaddeus is the agent, we'll get him on the show. Let's do that. Checklist.
Yeah.